tears are saying no, but your body's saying something else.
I got to fight back.
The winds of fate are merciless, twisting and turning lives in ways no one can predict. Alexandra has endured the unimaginable, fleeing for her life, trapped in a relentless battle between survival and fear.
Everywhere's America. Everywhere used to be our country. Not one of us ever escaped.
Every step forward is a gamble, every moment a test of her resilience. But as the walls begin to close and her breaking point is near, meanwhile, Spencer is racing against time, pushing past every obstacle in his path, knowing that one wrong move could mean losing Alexandra forever. The storm is brewing, and what happens next will change everything. Alexandra's breath was shallow, her body aching from exhaustion. Days had passed since she last felt the comfort of safety, and now every second was a fight to stay ahead of her pursuers. The cold bit at her skin, her clothes damp with sweat and dirt, but stopping was not an option. She had been running, hiding, and outmaneuvering the men who sought to drag her back to a life she refused to live. The rugged terrain had become both her prison and her shield, offering places to hide, but no real sanctuary. She pressed her body against the thick trunk of an old tree, trying to calm her pounding heart. The echoes of horse hooves in the distance sent waves of dread through her. They were getting closer. She tightened her grip on the small knife she had stolen, knowing it was a pathetic defense against the men hunting her. But she would rather die fighting than go back. Memories of the past haunted her, how she had once dreamed of adventure, of love, of a life beyond expectations. She had found that with Spencer, a man unlike any she had ever known. A man who had fought battles, conquered fear, and loved her with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. But now they were separated by an ocean, and she had no idea if he was even still alive. The thought was a wound deeper than any physical pain. She pushed herself forward, keeping low as she moved deeper into the forest. Her mind raced with possibilities. Where could she go? Who could she trust? The realization hit her hard. She was completely alone. And if she made one wrong move, she would never see the light of day again. Far from Alexandra's desperate fight, Spencer stood on the deck of a ship battered by the sea. His knuckles were white against the railing as he stared into the horizon, the weight of his mission pressing down on him. The delays, the obstacles, they were unbearable. He had never felt so powerless. Every second that passed was another second Alexandra was in danger, and he couldn't reach her fast enough. His mind played out the worst possibilities. He had seen war, had seen men fall in battle, but nothing terrified him more than the thought of losing her. The promise he had made to protect her felt like a cruel joke now. How could he protect her when he was thousands of miles away? The ship's captain approached with grim news. Another delay. Spencer clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. But surrender was not in his nature. He had fought against impossible odds before, and he would do it again. No matter what it took, he would get to her. As the night fell, Alexandra found herself in a small clearing, her body trembling from exhaustion. The silence around her was suffocating, every shadow feeling like a threat. She needed rest, but the fear of being caught kept her awake. Then a sound, a rustling in the distance. Her body tensed as she gripped her knife tighter. She wasn't alone. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. A figure stepped into view, and in that moment, Alexandra knew. Her time had run out. Alexandra's pulse pounded in her ears as she crouched in the darkness, gripping the small knife so tightly her fingers ached. The figure in the distance moved with careful precision, the deliberate steps of a hunter closing in on its prey. Moonlight flickered through the trees, casting shifting shadows across the damp earth. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. The exhaustion weighed her down like an anchor, her legs barely able to carry her any farther. She had been on the move for days, and now she was trapped. Her mind raced through the possibilities. If she made a sound, she would be caught. If she stayed, she risked being surrounded. There was only one way out: fight. Her heartbeat steadied as she reminded herself of the fire inside her. She had come too far, lost too much to let it end like this. The figure stepped closer, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots sending a chill through her spine. Then another sound. More footsteps. She wasn't facing one man. There were more. A voice muttered something in a language she barely recognized, and her stomach dropped. These weren't ordinary men. They were trackers trained in the art of finding and capturing those who
Alexandra
ran.
backed up
She had
slowly,
outmaneuvered
careful
them for
to
this
avoid
long,
snapping
but
a
she
twig
knew their
or
patience was
brushing
running
against
out.
a branch.
Her breaths were slow and controlled, but inside panic clawed at her. Then a mistake. Her foot slipped on damp soil, sending a tiny rock tumbling down a slope. The voices stopped. The air became unbearably still. A heartbeat later, the pursuit began. She bolted, her legs burning as she pushed forward, dodging between trees and leaping over fallen logs. The shouts behind her grew louder, the sound of boots pounding against the earth like war drums. They were closing in fast. Her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Every ounce of fear was drowned by the sheer will to survive. Branches tore at her skin as she ran, but she barely felt it. All that mattered was putting distance between herself and them. Then, in the chaos of the chase, she saw something ahead, a break in the trees, a chance. But just as hope sparked inside her, a sharp pain exploded in her shoulder. She stumbled, nearly falling before realizing what had happened. A whip-like weapon had struck her, a cruel tool, meant to slow her down without killing her. Pain radiated through her body, but she forced herself forward. She wouldn't let them take her. Not again. The edge of the forest was just ahead. If she could make it out, maybe she could disappear into the vastness beyond. Meanwhile, far across the sea, Spencer sat in silence, staring at the endless horizon. The ship rocked beneath him, the journey stretching longer than he could bear. He had never been a man who waited. Action was his nature, yet here he was forced into stillness while the woman he loved was in danger. The frustration gnawed at him, filling him with a rage that had no outlet. Every night he thought of her. He imagined her calling out for him, her voice lost in the wind. He had to get to her. He had to move faster. The delays, the storms, the endless obstacles, they were all wasting precious time. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the railing. He had fought wars, faced death countless times, but nothing terrified him more than the thought of losing Alexandra. His thoughts were interrupted by the ship's captain, who approached with grim news. There had been reports of unrest in the region where Alexandra had last been seen. Violence was spreading, and the road ahead was no longer safe. Spencer barely heard the words. Safe or not, nothing would stop him from reaching her. Back in the forest, Alexandra's strength was fading. The wound on her shoulder throbbed, and every step felt heavier. But just as she thought she couldn't go any farther, the trees parted. She stumbled into an open space, her breath catching as she saw what lay ahead. A river, fast-moving and deep. It was a risk, but it was her only option. The men were close behind, their voices growing louder. Without hesitation, she ran forward, plunging into the icy water. The shock sent a jolt through her body, but she pushed forward, letting the current pull her away. The shouts faded as the river carried her into the unknown. The fight wasn't over, but for now, she had escaped. For now, she still had a chance. The cold grip of the river wrapped around Alexandra's body, dragging her beneath the churning water as she struggled to stay afloat. Her lungs burned as she fought against the relentless current, her muscles screaming from exhaustion. The river was both her savior and her enemy, offering her an escape while threatening to pull her under. The weight of her soaked clothes slowed her movements each stroke through the water, feeling weaker than the last. The men chasing her had been left behind on the riverbank, their shouts drowned out by the rushing water, but she had no time to feel relief. Survival was not guaranteed. Her mind raced as she fought to control her body in the unpredictable currents. She had to find a way out before the river swallowed her completely. Her arms reached for anything solid, branches, rocks, anything that could pull her to safety. Then, through the darkness, she saw it. A partially submerged log ahead, caught between two boulders. Summoning what little strength she had left, she kicked toward it, fingers grasping the rough bark. Her body slammed against it with a force that rattled her bones, but she held on, pulling herself up onto the slick surface. She lay there for a moment, her chest rising and falling in deep, shuddering breaths. Every part of her body ached, but she wasn't safe yet. The river stretched out before her, disappearing into the fog that clung to the surface like an eerie veil. The forest on either side was dense and foreboding, and she had no idea where she was or how far she had drifted from the men hunting her. Shaking from cold and fatigue, Alexandra forced herself to move. She couldn't stay here. The river was too exposed and she was still too close to danger. She slid off the log into the shallower water near the bank. Her legs trembled as she pulled herself onto solid muddy shore, collapsing onto the damp earth. The silence around her was deafening. No voices, no footsteps, just the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of the river rushing away. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe she had finally escaped. Maybe she had outlasted them. But deep down, she knew better. Men like the ones hunting her didn't give up so easily. She was a loose thread in their carefully woven plans, and they would not rest until she was found. She pushed herself up, ignoring the pain that pulsed through her body. She had to move. Every second spent resting was another second closer to being recaptured. The forest stretched before her, dark and endless. She didn't know which way to go, but staying put wasn't an option. She forced one foot in front of the other, each step an act of sheer will. As she walked, her mind drifted to Spencer. The thought of him sent a wave of longing through her, but with it came pain. He didn't know where she was. He didn't know what she was facing. Would he ever find her? Would he even know she was in danger? She clung to the belief that he would. Spencer had never been a man who let go of what he loved. If there was even the slightest chance that he could reach her, she knew he would fight through anything to do it. Across the ocean, Spencer felt the weight of time pressing against him like an unbearable force. The ship had become his prison, each day stretching endlessly as he inched closer to his destination. Every night, his dreams were filled with images of Alexandra, lost, afraid, calling out to him. And every morning, he woke with a renewed sense of urgency. He had to get to her. But fate had other plans. The ship's captain delivered troubling news. Their journey had hit another delay. Unfavorable winds, political unrest, and now a sudden need for supplies had forced them to dock at a port far from their intended route. The frustration burned through Spencer like wildfire. Every delay was another day that Alexandra was alone, another day that she might not survive. He couldn't sit still any longer. He wouldn't. Determined to take matters into his own hands, he stormed off the ship and into the unfamiliar streets of the foreign port. His mind raced with possibilities. If he couldn't rely on the ship, he would find another way, a faster way. He had connections, he had resources, and he wasn't afraid to use them. Back in the wilderness, Alexandra's strength was waning. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and exhaustion made every step feel heavier. The wound on her shoulder throbbed with every movement, a constant reminder of how close she had come to being caught. She knew she had to find shelter before nightfall. The forest was unforgiving, and she was in no condition to face another battle. Then, through the dense trees, she spotted something. Smoke. It curled upward in thin tendrils, barely visible against the darkening sky. Hope flickered inside her, but so did fear. A fire meant people, but not all people could be trusted. She hesitated, weighing her options. Stay hidden and risk starvation, or take the chance and approach the fire. The choice was clear. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. With careful steps, she moved toward the smoke, each breath filled with anticipation. As she neared the clearing, she saw it. A small camp, a flickering fire, and a lone figure sitting beside it. He looked rugged, worn by the elements, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was no ordinary traveler. She had no choice but to step forward. The man turned, his eyes locking onto hers in an instant. Alexandra froze, her heart pounding. The next few moments would decide everything. Would he be her salvation or her downfall? The tension in the clearing was suffocating, the fire casting long, flickering shadows across the rugged stranger's face. Alexandra stood frozen, every nerve in her body on high alert. The man studied her with an unreadable expression, his sharp eyes scanning her torn dress, bruised skin, and the sheer exhaustion that clung to her like a second layer. She had no strength left to run, no fight left to give. If he was an enemy, she would not survive. But something about him told her he was different. His posture was wary, but not aggressive. His hands did not reach for a weapon. He had been alone, tending to his fire, and now fate had placed her in his path. The silence stretched between them before the man finally moved. He gestured toward the fire, a wordless invitation. Alexandra hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. The warmth of the flames was a sharp contrast to the cold she had endured, and as she lowered herself onto the ground, a deep shiver ran through her body. The man did not speak, did not press her for explanations. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small piece of bread, her fingers closed around the food, to her, and she brought it to her lips, chewing slowly despite the gnawing hunger in her stomach. Each bite felt like a lifeline, something anchoring her back to the world of the living. She could feel his gaze on her, waiting, assessing. He was trying to determine who she was, why she was out here alone, and whether she was worth helping. As the fire crackled between them, Alexandra felt her body giving into exhaustion. Every muscle screamed for rest, her eyelids heavy with fatigue, but her mind would not allow it. Even here, by the fire, she was not safe. She had been running for too long to believe in safety. Far from the wilderness, Spencer's urgency had transformed into action. He had spent hours combing through the unfamiliar port, seeking passage, bribing whoever would listen. He had no time for delays, no patience for bureaucracy. The world was moving too slowly while Alexandra was out there, alone and vulnerable. He had never felt so powerless, so desperate to bend time to his will. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A merchant ship, fast and lightly burdened, was set to sail before dawn. The captain was hesitant, but gold had a way of changing minds. Spencer secured his passage, his heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to hope. He would get to her. He had to. The sea stretched before him, endless and dark. But Spencer no longer feared the vastness of the unknown. His fear lay elsewhere, on the land he had left behind, where Alexandra was trapped in a game far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. He had promised to protect her, and he had failed. But he would not fail again. Back in the wilderness, Alexandra's instincts kept her awake despite the warmth of the fire and the exhaustion that pulled at her limbs. The stranger had not spoken much, but she had learned enough. He was a hunter, a man who lived off the land. He had no allegiance to those who sought to control Montana, no interest in the war that loomed over its horizon. He was simply surviving. And yet, there was something in his gaze that told her he knew more than he let on. As the night stretched on, the distant sound of horses reached her ears, sending a jolt of fear through her body. They were coming. The men who hunted her were still searching, still relentless in their pursuit. The stranger noticed her sudden tension, his sharp eyes narrowing. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. He simply stood, doused the fire with a swift motion, and gestured for her to follow. There was no time to question his motives. Alexandra rose to her feet, ignoring the pain that shot through her body, and followed him into the darkness of the trees. Each step was measured, careful. The night was their ally now, the shadows hiding them from the predators that lurked nearby. She did not know where he was leading her. She did not know if she could trust him. But right now, trust was a luxury she could not afford to question. If he could help her stay one step ahead of her pursuers, that was enough. The forest closed around them, the sound of approaching riders growing fainter as they moved deeper into the unknown. Alexandra's breath was ragged, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She had survived another night, but the battle was far from over. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on Alexandra, but fear kept her moving. The stranger ahead of her led the way through the dense forest, his steps silent and deliberate. She followed, matching his pace, her instincts screaming at her to trust no one. The sound of distant hooves had faded, but the threat remained. The men hunting her were relentless, and she knew they would not stop until they found her. Every snapped twig, every rustling branch sent her nerves into overdrive, but the stranger never hesitated. He moved as if he knew these woods like the back of his hand, as if he had walked these trails 1,000 times before. The night stretched on, the cold biting at her exposed skin. Her body ached from the countless miles she had traveled, and her vision blurred with exhaustion. She wanted to collapse, to sink into the forest floor and let sleep consume her, but she forced herself forward. Giving up was not an option. Not when Spencer was out there, fighting his own battle to reach her. The stranger finally stopped, his hand raised in a silent signal. Alexandra froze, barely breathing as she watched him scan their surroundings. He crouched low, pressing his fingers into the earth as if feeling for something unseen. Then, without a word, he motioned for her to follow him toward a small outcropping of rocks nestled against the slope of a hill. He pressed his palm against a seemingly ordinary boulder, and to Alexandra's shock, the rock shifted, revealing a hidden crevice. Her breath caught in her throat. A hiding place. A sanctuary. The stranger slipped inside first, and she hesitated for only a second before following. Inside, the air was damp and cool, the space just large enough to fit the two of them. The entrance was narrow, almost imperceptible from the outside. Once the rock was moved back into place, they were completely concealed. For the first time in what felt like days, Alexandra allowed herself a moment to breathe. She slumped against the rough stone wall, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. The stranger sat across from her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. They both understood the situation. Minutes passed, then hours. Alexandra's eyelids grew heavy, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been clawing at her. Sleep came in waves, shallow and restless. Nightmares lurked beneath the surface, memories of bloodshed and betrayal haunting her even in the safety of the cave. She dreamed of Spencer, of his hands reaching for her across a vast ocean, his voice calling her name. But the sea was too wide, the waves too strong. He was slipping away. When she woke, the light filtering through the narrow opening told her it was morning. The stranger was still there, watching the entrance with unwavering focus. She realized then that he had not slept, that he had stayed awake to keep watch. Gratitude swelled in her chest, but she said nothing. Words felt inadequate. Far from the wilderness, Spencer's journey was nearing its next stage. The ship he had boarded was cutting through the ocean at an unforgiving speed, but to him, it still wasn't fast enough. Every second felt like an eternity, every hour another missed opportunity to save Alexandra. He had never known desperation like this before. The thought of her, alone and in danger, consumed him. He had left her once, and it had nearly broken him. He would not make that mistake again. But Spencer was not the only one moving toward a collision course with fate. Back in Montana, the war for the Dutton land was escalating. Jacob Dutton stood at the heart of the storm, his determination unwavering despite the forces closing in on him. Enemies lurked in every shadow, alliances shifted like sand beneath his feet, and the land itself seemed to tremble under the weight of impending violence. The men who sought to take what was his were growing bolder, their attacks more frequent, their threats more dangerous. The battle lines had been drawn, and soon there would be no turning back. Alexandra's struggle was not just her own. It was part of something far greater, a fight that stretched beyond her and Spencer, beyond the love they had clung to in the face of chaos. She had been swept into a war she barely understood, a war where power was the only currency, and mercy was a weakness no one could afford. As the sun climbed higher, the stranger finally spoke for the first time since their escape into the cave. His voice was rough, edged with the weight of experience. He told her the truth she had been too afraid to face. There would be no easy escape. The men hunting her were ruthless, and they would not stop. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to make it back to Spencer, she would have to fight. The words settled heavily in her chest, but she knew he was right. The time for running was over. If she wanted to reclaim her future, she would have to take control of her fate. She met the stranger's gaze, determination burning in her eyes. No more waiting. No more hiding. It was time to fight back. The weight of Alexandra's decision settled heavily in her chest. She had spent days running, evading, surviving, but now she had no choice but to face the storm head-on. The stranger beside her, though still a mystery, had given her a harsh truth. Survival was not just about endurance. It was about standing up and fighting when there was no other option left. She was done being the prey. If she wanted to see Spencer again, if she wanted to reclaim her life, she had to become something more than a woman on the run. The morning air outside the cave was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine filling Alexandra's lungs as she stepped cautiously into the open. The stranger followed behind, his sharp gaze scanning the trees for any sign of movement. They had a long journey ahead of them, and the enemy was still out there searching. But something inside her had shifted. Fear was no longer the dominant force driving her forward. Determination had taken its place. Miles away, Spencer's ship cut through the sea, relentless in its pursuit of the shore. His heart pounded with impatience. Every wave that crashed against the vessel felt like a wasted moment, a delay keeping him from the woman who needed him. He had fought too hard, lost too much, to let Alexandra slip through his grasp now. He had once been a man consumed by war, hardened by battles and distant lands. Montana, too, was teetering on the brink of chaos. The Dutton family stood at the center of an unavoidable war. Jacob Dutton had faced enemies before, but never had the stakes felt this high. The powerful men who wanted to take their land had grown bolder, their threats turning into violent action. The Duttons had always been warriors in their own right, but this was different. This was a battle not just for land, but for survival itself. The land of Montana had been drenched in blood before, and it was clear it would be again. As Alexandra and the stranger moved through the forest, the signs of danger were everywhere. Broken branches, tracks in the dirt, distant echoes of movement. They were being hunted. The men chasing her were professionals, relentless in their pursuit, and she knew that if they caught her, there would be no mercy. The stranger motioned for her to stop, his hand tightening around the knife at his waist. Silence stretched between them as they listened. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crept closer. The enemy was near. Adrenaline coursed through Alexandra's veins, but she fought to keep her breathing steady. Every lesson she had learned on this journey, every hardship she had endured, had led to this moment. She gripped the knife the stranger had given her, its weight foreign but comforting in her palm. There would be no more running. If she wanted to make it out of this alive, she had to fight. The first attacker appeared from the trees, his weapon drawn, his expression ruthless. But Alexandra didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed she didn't know she possessed, she lunged forward, using every ounce of strength to drive her blade into his side. A choked gasp escaped his lips as he stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. Before he could react, the stranger was already upon the others, striking with brutal efficiency. The forest erupted into chaos. Alexandra ducked, dodging a wild swing aimed at her, her heart pounding as she fought to keep control of her fear. The world narrowed into a blur of movement, shouts, the clash of weapons, the scent of blood in the air. But through it all, something inside her ignited. She wasn't the same woman who had fled in desperation. She wasn't the helpless noblewoman who had once lived in a world of privilege and comfort. She was a fighter now, a survivor. The battle was over in minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The last of their attackers fell, motionless on the forest floor. Alexandra's breath came in ragged gasps, her hands shaking, but she was alive. She had fought. She had survived. The stranger wiped the blood from his blade, nodding at her with a silent respect. She had proven herself, not just to him, but to herself. But there was no time for celebration. They had to keep moving. The danger was far from over. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Spencer finally saw the distant outline of land. His heart clenched. He was close. He was almost there. But he had no idea what he would find when he arrived. The fear of losing Alexandra, of being too late, gnawed at his soul. He could only pray that she was still alive, still waiting for him. Back in Montana, the Duttons prepared for war. Jacob Dutton stood on his land, staring out over the vast horizon, knowing that the battle for their future was coming faster than any of them had anticipated. The enemy was strong, their influence far-reaching, but the Duttons had something their rivals didn't, an unbreakable will to fight for what was theirs. Alexandra, now hardened by the trials she had faced, pressed forward. She would find Spencer. She would make it back to him. And together, they would face whatever came next. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe our channel. Thanks.